Cyrus the Great, the king who changed the world. Imagine this. You are standing at the edge of the most powerful empire on earth. Soldiers stretch out in every direction, as far as your eyes can see. Thousands of warriors in gleaming armor. War horses stamping the dry ground. Chariots lined up like metal monsters, ready to charge. And at the center of it all, at the very heart of this enormous, terrifying army, stands one man. He's not a giant. He doesn't breathe fire. He doesn't have superpowers. But this man, this one person, is about to do something so extraordinary, so impossible, that historians would still be writing about it 2,500 years later. He is about to take a small group of half-forgotten mountain tribes, people that the whole ancient world looked down on, and build the largest empire the planet had ever seen. He is about to conquer kingdoms that had stood for centuries in a matter of years. He is about to free thousands of enslaved people and send them home. And he is about to change the very idea of what it means to be a king. His name. And this is his story. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going on one of the greatest adventures in all of human history. We're traveling back, way back, to a time before smartphones, before cars, before electricity, before even the Roman Empire existed. We're going to ancient Persia. Now, before we dive in, let's get our bearings. Because when you're talking about history this old, it's easy to feel a little lost. The story of Cyrus the Great takes place mostly between the years 600 and 530 BCE. BCE stands for Before Common Era, which is just a way of saying before year 0 on our modern calendar. So we're talking about events that happened over 2,500 years ago. To put that in perspective, that's 5 times further back in history than Christopher Columbus sailing to the Americas. That's about 6 times further back than the signing of the American Declaration of Independence. That is seriously old. And yet, we know quite a lot about Cyrus. His name appears in ancient clay tablets, in royal inscriptions, in the Bible, in Greek history books, and in Persian legends. He was so famous, so respected, that even his enemies admired him. The Greek historian Xenophon, a writer who lived just a century after Cyrus, wrote an entire book about him, almost like a biography. He called it the Cyropaedia, which basically means the education of Cyrus. It was one of the most popular books in the ancient world. Even centuries later, great leaders like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Thomas Jefferson kept copies of it and read it for inspiration. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States, owned 2 copies of the Cyropaedia, 2 copies of a book about a Persian king who lived 2,000 years before Jefferson was even born. That should tell you something about how incredible this person was. So buckle up, because we are about to go on a journey through ancient Persia, through kingdoms of gold and fire, through epic battles and daring escapes, through moments of cruelty and moments of breathtaking kindness. This is the full, true, deeply fascinating story of Cyrus the Great. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The World Before Cyrus, a Land of Empires and Fire. To understand why Cyrus was so extraordinary, you first need to understand the world he was born into. Because the world of 600 BCE was not a peaceful place. Imagine a giant chessboard covering the whole Middle East, what we today call Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and the surrounding regions. Now imagine that instead of chess pieces, this board is covered with massive, powerful, violent kingdoms, all competing with each other for land, gold, and power. In the west, there was the kingdom of Lydia, famous for its incredible wealth. The Lydians are actually credited with inventing metal coins. Before Lydia, people would trade by exchanging goods. You give me some grain, I'll give you some sheep. But the Lydians started stamping small pieces of gold and silver with official marks and using them as money. Their king, a man named Croesus, was so spectacularly rich that even today, when someone is incredibly wealthy, though we sometimes say they are as rich as Croesus. Further south was Egypt, ancient, mysterious, immensely powerful, ruled by the pharaohs and protected by the flooding Nile River. To the north and east of Persia was the kingdom of the Medes, a powerful, sophisticated people who were actually cousins of the Persians. The Medes had their own empire, and their capital city, Ecbatana, sat high in the mountains like a fortress carved from the earth itself. But the most terrifying kingdom of all was Babylon. Oh, Babylon, If you looked up powerful ancient city in a dictionary, they might just put a picture of Babylon. Located in what is today the country of Iraq, Babylon was one of the greatest cities in the entire ancient world. It had towering walls, so thick that ancient writers claimed 2 chariots could race side by side along the top of them. It had the famous Hanging Gardens, which were said to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It had enormous temples called ziggurats, stepped pyramids reaching up toward the sky, and a population of hundreds of thousands of people. The Babylonian Empire, under its powerful kings, had conquered huge amounts of land. They had destroyed Jerusalem, the holy city of the Jewish people, in 586 BCE, burning the great temple to the ground and dragging the Jewish people away from their homeland into captivity. That event is called the Babylonian Captivity or the Babylonian Exile, and it was one of the most heartbreaking moments in ancient Jewish history. At the time of Cyrus's birth, around 600 BCE, though scholars debate the exact date, the Persians were not a powerful empire, not even close. They were a collection of semi-nomadic tribes living in a rugged, mountainous region of the Iranian plateau called Persis or Parsa, which is where we get the name Persia. The Persians were tough, hardy people. They were skilled horsemen and fighters. They knew their land, the mountains, the passes, the rivers, the secret paths. But compared to the Medes, the Lydians, and the Babylonians, they were small, they were poor, they were by most measures nobody. And that is exactly what made what happened next so completely astonishing. Fun fact, the word paradise actually comes from an old Persian word, paridesa, which meant an enclosed garden or park. When the ancient Persians built their royal gardens, Greek visitors were so amazed by them that they borrowed the Persian word, and over time it became our word, paradise. So next time someone says a place is paradise, they're actually using a word that's over 2,500 years old. So now you understand the world, a chessboard of empires, the Persians, a small overlooked people on the eastern edge of it all. Now we need to meet the boy who would flip that entire chessboard over. Stay with us, because the story of how Cyrus was born and what the legends say about his childhood is one of the wildest, most dramatic origin stories in all of ancient history. Chapter 2, A Boy Born to Change Everything, the Birth and Prophecy of Cyrus. Every great hero in history has a birth story, and almost always those birth stories involve prophecies, warnings, and someone desperately trying to prevent the hero from being born. Cyrus the Great is no exception. In fact, his birth story, as told by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, is so dramatic, so full of twists and turns, that it sounds more like a fairy tale than history. And yet, at the core of it, there are real events, real people, and real history. Let's break it down. Cyrus was born around 600 BCE, though some historians place his birth closer to 590, or even 585 BCE. The exact date is one of those mysteries that the ancient world didn't bother to record precisely. They didn't have birth certificates back then. What we do know is that he was born in the region of Persis, in the southwestern part of the Iranian plateau. His father was a man named Cambyses I. Cambyses was the king of Anshan, a small semi-independent Persian kingdom. He was a real king with a real throne, but he ruled under the authority of the Medes, paying them tribute, which basically means taxes or payments to show that he accepted their power over him. So even Cyrus's father, the king, was in some ways a subject of the Median Empire. His mother was named Mandane, and here is where the story gets truly extraordinary. Mandane was the daughter of Astyages, the king of the Medes. Read that again slowly. Cyrus's mother was the daughter of the Median king. That means Cyrus, the man who would one day overthrow the entire Median Empire, was the grandson of the very king he overthrew. But here's the twist. According to Herodotus, Astyages didn't want his daughter to marry a Persian. In fact, he had a very specific reason to be nervous about it. Before Mandane was married, Astyages had a dream. In his dream, he saw a vine, a climbing plant, growing out of his daughter Mandane's body, and that vine grew and grew until it covered all of Asia. Astyages woke up in a cold sweat and immediately called his wise men, called Magi, which were ancient Persian priests and interpreters of dreams. He asked them what the dream meant. The Magi told him, "This dream means that one day a son born from Mandan's body will rule over all of Asia. He will have more power than any king alive." Astyages was terrified. He didn't want his power taken away. He didn't want to be overthrown. So he did the only thing he could think of. He married Mandane, off to the least powerful, most insignificant Persian king he could find. Someone he could control. Someone who would never be a threat. That person was Cambyses I of Anshan, Cyrus's father. Astyages thought, problem solved. If Mandane marries a weak, unimportant man, any son she has won't be dangerous. Except the dreams kept coming. When Mandane became pregnant, Astyages had another dream. This time he saw a river of water burst forth from his daughter and flood all of Asia. Once again he called the Magi. Once again they told him, "This child will one day rule everything." Now Astyages was truly afraid. He did something terrible. He ordered his closest adviser, a nobleman named Harpagus, to take the infant as soon as it was born, carry it out into the wilderness, and leave it there to die. Harpagus was horrified. He was a nobleman, not a murderer, but he was also terrified of disobeying the king, so he took the baby, a tiny newborn just days old, and carried him away from the palace. But Harpagus couldn't bring himself to do it directly, so he gave the baby to a herdsman, a man who looked after cattle, named Mithridates, and told him to take the infant into the mountains and abandon him there. Mithridates took the baby home to his wife. And here the story takes one of its most beautiful turns. The herdsman's wife had recently given birth to a baby of her own, but that baby had been born dead. She was heartbroken, and now here was this infant, abandoned and crying, needing a mother. She refused to let the baby die. Instead, she persuaded her husband to keep the baby, raise him as their own son, and place her own dead infant in the wilderness instead, telling Harpagus that it was Mandane's child who had died. And that is how Cyrus, the future king of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, grew up as the son of a herdsman in the mountains of Persia. Now, there's something very important to understand here. This story, the dream, the prophecy, the abandoned baby raised by shepherds, is almost certainly a legend. The Greeks loved stories like this. You can find similar tales in many ancient cultures. Moses in the river, Romulus and Remus raised by a wolf, the story of Oedipus. These kinds of hidden child who grows up to be a great ruler stories were a way for ancient people to explain extraordinary lives in ways that felt as magical as those lives deserved. Did it really happen exactly this way? Historians are divided. What we know for certain is that Cyrus did have connections to both the Persian and Median royal families, and that he did eventually overthrow his grandfather Astyages. Whether a dream predicted it or not, well, that's part of what makes ancient history so wonderfully mysterious. Fun fact: the story of a baby left to die, but secretly raised by humble parents, shows up over and over in ancient legends. It's called an exposure myth, and historians think these stories served a purpose. They showed that greatness can come from anywhere, not just from powerful families. Pretty inspiring message, right? But wait, if Cyrus was supposed to be dead, how did Astyages find out his grandson was alive? Oh, the story gets better, much better, and it involves a group of boys, a game, and a beating that changed the world. Chapter 3, The Boy Who Played King, Cyrus's Childhood Revealed. Cyrus grew up in the Persian mountains as the son of a herdsman, which meant his childhood was nothing like a prince's. He spent his days outdoors, in the rugged landscape of Persia, learning to ride horses, to handle animals, to survive in a tough environment. He was strong, he was smart, he was natural leader even as a child, and that is exactly what got him caught. According to Herodotus, when Cyrus was about 10 years old, he was playing with a group of boys in the village. They decided to play a game of king and subjects, which was basically like playing king the way kids today might play superheroes or teacher in class. The boys chose Cyrus to be the king because he was obviously the best at it. He was confident and commanding even as a child. Cyrus threw himself into the role. He appointed different boys to different positions, some as guards, some as messengers, some as workers. He gave orders. He made decisions. But then one boy, the son of a real Median nobleman named Artembaris, refused to obey Cyrus's pretend commands. Cyrus, playing his role seriously, had the boy seized and whipped as punishment for disobeying the king's orders. The nobleman's son was furious and humiliated. He ran to his father, showed him the marks from the whipping, and demanded justice. Artambaras was outraged. He went directly to King Astyages and said, "This boy, this herdsman's son, dared to beat my child as if he were a king. This is an insult to our whole class." Astyages summoned Cyrus and the herdsman, Mithridates, to appear before him at the palace. When Astyages sternly asked the boy why he had struck a nobleman's son, Cyrus looked the king directly in the eye, which was already startling behavior for a peasant boy, and said simply that the boy had been chosen king by all his friends and had refused to obey, and if there was punishment coming for that, he accepted it. But he had done nothing wrong. Astyages was struck by the boy's bearing. There was something about him, the way he stood, the way he met a king's gaze without flinching, the sheer confidence and dignity of him, that made Astyages feel a chill deep in his chest. He looked more carefully at the boy's face, and something inside him trembled. This child had a face he recognized. Astyages dismissed Artambaras with gifts and apologies, and then he turned to the herdsman Mithridates and began to question him seriously. And under the king's terrifying pressure, the old herdsman confessed everything. How Harpagus had brought him the baby, how his wife had refused to abandon it, how they had raised the child as their own. Astyages sat back on his throne, looking at the boy before him. His grandson, the prophecy, the one he had tried so hard to prevent, had survived. Now what Astyages did next was both calculating and deeply cruel, and it tells us a lot about the kind of king he was. He pretended to be fine with it. He smiled at Cyrus, told him to go enjoy the city, sent him off to have fun. He even had a message sent to Harpagus, his advisor, the man who had been supposed to kill the baby, saying, "Come to the palace, I'm celebrating." Harpagus, relieved, came to the palace. He assumed he was being forgiven. Instead, Astyages served him a meal, a horrible, unspeakable meal. After Harpagus had eaten, the king casually asked him how he had enjoyed the food. Harpagus said it was excellent. Then servants brought in a covered dish and removed the lid. Inside were the head, hands, and feet of Harpagus's own son. Astyages had killed Harpagus's boy and served him as dinner. This was the king's punishment for Harpagus's disobedience, for not personally killing the infant Cyrus as ordered. Harpagus sat very still. He controlled his face. He told the king he understood the decision was the king's to make, and that he accepted it. He said nothing more. But inside a fire had been lit, a fire of cold, patient, absolute hatred. And that fire would one day help destroy Astyages' entire kingdom. Meanwhile, what happened to young Cyrus? Astyages had consulted his magi again about what to do. They told him, the prophecy has already been fulfilled. The boy already played at being king. He was already king in that children's game. The dream has come true in a small way. You have nothing more to fear. Astyages, perhaps persuaded, perhaps simply unwilling to kill his own grandson now that he had met him, made a decision. He sent Cyrus home to Persia, to his real parents, the nobleman Cambyses and the princess Mandane. And so Cyrus went home to Persia, to his royal father, and grew up in the world where he truly belonged. Fun fact, the story of Cyrus's childhood sounds almost exactly like the story of Moses in the Bible, a baby hidden from a powerful king who wants him dead, raised in secret by humble people, revealed later when he's grown. Many historians think these kinds of stories reflected a real fear that ancient kings had, that the child they tried to destroy would one day come back to overthrow them. Cyrus had survived. He had met his grandfather and walked away. He had gone home to Persia. And somewhere in the palace of the Medes, Harpagus sat quietly in the ruins of his grief, biding his time, waiting. The stage was being set. The chessboard was arranging its pieces. And the greatest empire in the ancient world was about to be born. Chapter 4. The Lion Awakens. Cyrus unites the Persian tribes. Let's talk about what Persia actually looked like when Cyrus grew up there in the early 500s BCE. The Persian people were organized into a group of related tribes. Ancient Persian texts refer to 10 main tribal groups. Some were nomadic, meaning they moved around following herds and seasons. Others were settled farmers and craftspeople. All of them were tough, skilled fighters who knew the mountains of southwestern Iran like the backs of their hands. But they were not united. This is the crucial thing to understand. The Persian tribes existed as separate groups, often with their own local leaders, their own loyalties, their own feuds. The idea of Persia as one unified country with one king was not really a solid reality yet. When Cyrus's father Cambyses died, sometime around 559 BCE, Cyrus inherited the kingship of Anshan. Anshan was one of the main Persian territories, but it was still technically under Median authority. The Medes were the bosses. The Persians paid them tribute. Cyrus became king at what scholars believe was somewhere between his late 20s and early 30s. And from the very beginning of his kingship, he was different from other rulers. Here's the thing about Cyrus that you need to understand, because it explains everything he ever did. He was not just a warrior, he was a thinker. Most ancient kings conquered people through pure force. Show up with a bigger army, smash your enemy, drag off the survivors in chains. That was the standard playbook. Cyrus had a completely different playbook. He conquered with strategy. He conquered with psychology. He conquered by making people want to follow him, by making surrender feel less like defeat and more like joining something good. We'll see this play out over and over again as we go through his conquests. But first, he had to unite the Persians. The ancient sources tell us that Cyrus worked to bring the various Persian tribes together under his banner. He used a combination of political skill, personal charisma, military pressure, and smart alliances to forge the separate tribes into one people with one leader. One story that has been passed down, partly as legend, partly as history, gives us a vivid picture of how he did it. Cyrus reportedly called together the Persian people for a massive gathering. He gave them all a simple, back-breaking task: clear a large area of land covered in thorns and scrub brush. For an entire day, the Persians labored under the hot sun, hacking and pulling and sweating. The next day, Cyrus called them together again, but this time for a feast, tables covered in food, wine flowing, music playing. Then he asked them which day was better. The answer was obvious. Cyrus said, "Follow me, work with me, and I promise you that every day of your life will be like this second day, full of honor, full of reward. Continue to live under the Medes, and you will spend every day like the first, laboring for someone else's benefit." It was a simple speech, but it was powerful. It turned work into purpose. It made people feel that following Cyrus wasn't just loyalty, it was the smart choice, the good choice. That kind of leadership, inspiring rather than just commanding, was Cyrus's secret weapon. With the Persian tribes unified behind him, Cyrus now turned his eyes toward the great power that had always looked down on Persia. He turned his eyes toward the Medes, and in the palace of the Median king, an old nobleman named Harpagus, who had once been forced to eat an unspeakable dinner at the king's command, was quietly sending letters. Cyrus was one of the first rulers in history to use what we might today call propaganda, using stories, speeches, and symbols to shape how people thought about him and his reign. He was careful about his image and understood that winning hearts was just as important as winning battles. Cyrus had his army, he had his plan, he had a secret ally inside the enemy's camp. And now he was ready for the first and perhaps most personal conquest of his life. Chapter 5, Fall of the Medes, the Grandson's Revenge. The year was approximately 553 BCE. Cyrus the Great, king of Anshan, formally declared rebellion against the Median Empire. Now from the outside, this looked completely insane. The Median Empire was massive. It stretched across enormous swaths of the ancient world, from the borders of Lydia in the west all the way to the edges of Central Asia in the east. The Medes had a powerful, battle-hardened army. They had wealth, infrastructure, experience. They had been a great power for generations. The Persians? Small, outnumbered, mountainous territory, yes, but no great cities, no huge treasury, no centuries of imperial experience. On paper, this rebellion should have been crushed in weeks. But Cyrus knew something that King Astyages didn't fully appreciate. He knew that many of the Medes themselves were tired of Astyages. Astyages was not a beloved king. He was cruel, he was proud, and he had a talent for making enemies. His own nobles resented him. His generals were not fanatically loyal. And one of those generals, one of the most important commanders in the Median army, had been sitting quietly for years, waiting for exactly this moment. Harpagus had never forgotten what Astyages did to his son. He had smiled, bowed, and served the king faithfully on the surface. But underneath, he had spent years quietly building connections, having careful conversations. testing loyalties. And when Cyrus raised the banner of rebellion, Harpagus was ready. He had been in secret communication with Cyrus, passing messages back and forth. According to Herodotus, one of these messages was smuggled in an extraordinary way, written on a letter that was hidden inside a dead rabbit, which was then carried by a trusted messenger, disguised as a hunter. When Astyages sent Harpagus with the Median army to crush Cyrus's rebellion, what happened was not what anyone expected. In the heat of the battle, Harpagus turned. He led a massive portion of the Median army across to Cyrus's side, switching allegiances in the middle of the battle itself. The Medes, suddenly abandoned and betrayed by their own general, crumbled. Astyages tried to rally, tried to throw together a new defense, even reportedly executed the Magi who had once told him his fears about Cyrus were exaggerated. But it was too late. Around 550, Cyrus captured Astyages. And now everyone expected something very specific to happen. Everyone expected Cyrus to do what every other ancient conqueror did. They expected him to kill the defeated king publicly, to humiliate him, to drag him through the streets, to make an example of him. That is how it was done. That was the rule. Cyrus did no such thing. He spared Astyages' life. He treated him with respect. He allowed him to live out the rest of his days in a comfortable, if monitored, existence within the Persian court. His own grandfather, the man who had tried to have him killed as a baby, the man who had served Harpagus his own son for dinner. Cyrus looked at him and chose mercy. Cyrus was sending a message to every kingdom in the ancient world. Surrender to me, and you will not be destroyed. Fight me to the last, and we will fight. But if you accept my rule, I will treat you with dignity. It was a revolutionary idea, and it worked. The Median Empire didn't resist further. Its cities and nobles submitted to Cyrus. And incredibly, Cyrus did something even more remarkable. He incorporated the Medes into his new empire as partners, not slaves. Median nobles kept positions of power. Median culture was respected. The Medes and Persians became one combined civilization, and together they would form the foundation of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. The Achaemenid Empire, named after Achaemens, a legendary ancestor of the Persian royal family, had been born. Cyrus was now king not just of Persia, but of Persia and Media combined. In one stroke, he had doubled his territory, tripled his resources, and established himself as a major power in the ancient world. But he was far from done. Fun fact, Cyrus's decision to spare Astyages was so unusual in the ancient world that it became famous. Most ancient kings celebrated their victories by publicly humiliating or executing defeated rulers. Cyrus's mercy was so consistent that it became part of his reputation, and that reputation made other kingdoms more willing to surrender to him without a fight, because they knew he wouldn't automatically destroy them. Two great empires still stood in his path to the west. One was fabulously, almost comically rich, ruled by a king so wealthy that his name became a byword for fortune itself. The other was the mightiest city on earth. And between Cyrus and those two empires stood nothing but desert, determination, and destiny. Chapter 6, The Richest King in the World, The War with Lydia. King Croesus of Lydia. Just say that name out loud. It sounds like money. It sounds like golden coins clinking together. Croesus ruled the kingdom of Lydia in what is today the western part of Turkey, and he was, by every account, extraordinarily, almost unbelievably wealthy. The Lydians controlled gold-rich rivers. In fact, a river called the Pactolus, which flowed near the Lydian capital city of Sardis, actually carried gold deposits in its waters. The local legend said the god Midas, the mythical king who turned everything he touched to gold, had washed away his golden curse in that river, leaving gold behind forever. Real or legend, Lydia's wealth was real, and Croesus, the king who sat at the center of all that gold, was famous throughout the ancient world as the richest man alive. Now, Croesus was not a foolish king. He was actually quite intelligent and sophisticated, and when he looked east and saw what Cyrus had done, when he saw how quickly this Persian upstart had swallowed the entire Median Empire, he was worried, very worried. He decided to do something smart. He consulted the oracle at Delphi. Now, in the ancient Greek world, the oracle at Delphi was like the most famous fortune-teller in history. People came from all over the Mediterranean world to ask the oracle questions about the future. The oracle was a woman, called the Pythia, who sat over a crack in the earth at the temple of Apollo in the Greek city of Delphi. She would breathe in mysterious vapors rising from below, fall into a kind of trance, and deliver prophecies. The prophecies were famous for being tricky. Croesus sent messengers loaded with magnificent gifts, gold, silver, jewels, to Delphi, and asked the oracle his burning question: "If I go to war with Cyrus the Persian, what will happen?" The oracle replied with a famous answer: "If you cross the river Halys and attack Cyrus, a great empire will be destroyed." Croesus was thrilled. A great empire destroyed. Clearly, he thought, this means I will destroy Cyrus. He began gathering one of the greatest armies the ancient world had ever assembled. He formed alliances with the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Spartans, the most fearsome warriors in Greece. He was building a coalition to crush Persia before Cyrus could grow any stronger. Around 547 BCE, Croesus crossed the Halys River with his massive army and invaded Cappadocia, a territory in central Turkey, which was now under Cyrus's control. The two armies met in a battle that was brutal but inconclusive. Neither side clearly won. Croesus, running low on supplies and thinking Cyrus would need time to regroup after winter, retreated to his capital city of Sardis and sent his armies home for the season. He planned to reassemble them in the spring. He made a fatal error. He assumed Cyrus would also go home for winter. Cyrus didn't stop. Cyrus chased Croesus across the desert. He marched his entire army at top speed all the way to Sardis before Croesus could even reassemble his forces or call for his allies. When Croesus realized what was happening, that the Persian army was literally at his city's gates, he panicked. He called out what cavalry he had. Lydian cavalry was famous for being among the best horsemen in the world, but Cyrus had a secret weapon. One of his generals, a brilliant Median commander, suggested a trick. He knew that horses were terrified of camels, something about their smell, their strange appearance. The Lydian horses had probably never even seen a camel up close. Cyrus placed his baggage camels at the front of the Persian advance. The Lydian horses caught one smell of those camels and went absolutely berserk, bucking, screaming, throwing their riders, refusing to charge. The famous Lydian cavalry was neutralized in moments. The Persians swept through. Croesus retreated into Sardis, and Cyrus besieged the city. Sardis was considered nearly impregnable. Its walls were built on massive cliffs, and the city was thought to be one of the most defensible fortresses in the world. Croesus expected to hold out until his allies arrived, but Cyrus's soldiers were watching carefully, and one of them noticed something. A Lydian soldier had accidentally dropped his helmet off the wall. The soldier climbed down the cliff face to retrieve it, following a secret path that the defenders thought was too steep for any attacker to use. Cyrus's men watched, memorized the route, and that night a small group of Persian soldiers climbed up the supposedly unclimbable cliff, reached the top, and opened the gates. Fell. Croesus was captured, and now everyone was holding their breath, because what Cyrus did next would say everything about what kind of king he truly was. The Lydians prepared for the worst, Croesus prepared for death. According to the ancient stories, as Cyrus's soldiers led the captured Croesus to his execution, he was going to be burned alive, the traditional fate for defeated kings. Croesus sat down on the pile of wood and spoke, seemingly to himself, the name of his old friend and wise man, the Athenian lawgiver Solon. Cyrus, curious, asked why he kept saying that name. Croesus told him a story about how Solon had once visited him years ago when Croesus was at the height of his power. Croesus had shown off all his riches and asked Solon, "Am I not the happiest man alive?" And the wise Solon had said, "Call no man happy until he is dead," because fortune can always turn. No matter how rich, how powerful, how secure you feel, things can change in an instant. And now, as Croesus sat on a funeral pyre about to be burned, he finally understood what Solon had meant. Cyrus listened to this story, and he had the fire extinguished. He spared Croesus. He treated him with honor. He even, according to some accounts, kept Croesus at his court as a kind of adviser, a living reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that wisdom matters more than wealth. Lydia was now part of the Persian Empire. The oracle at Delphi's prophecy to Croesus was technically correct. A great empire was destroyed when he attacked Cyrus. It was just his empire, not Cyrus's. The oracle's prophecies were deliberately vague and could be interpreted in multiple ways. Ancient people understood this, but many, like Croesus, heard what they wanted to hear. Cyrus had now conquered Media and Lydia. His empire stretched from the borders of India in the east to the Aegean Sea, the body of water on the coast of modern Turkey, in the west. But one kingdom remained, the greatest prize of all. Chapter 7. The City That Could Not Fall, The Conquest of Babylon. Let me paint you a picture of Babylon in 539 BCE. Imagine a city so large that when you stood at its western gates, you could not see the eastern walls. A city of 200,000 people, one of the largest populations on earth at that time. A city of towering temples, of stone palaces, of markets overflowing with goods from every corner of the known world. The walls of Babylon were legendary. Ancient writers describe them as anywhere from 25 to 100 meters high. Estimates vary, but everyone agreed they were enormous. The walls were so thick that multiple chariots could ride side by side along the top. The city was surrounded by a massive moat. It had strong inner and outer walls. The Euphrates River ran directly through the middle of the city, entering and exiting through specially constructed gates with iron bars that allowed water to pass but no human. Babylonian generals looked at their city and believed it was simply impossible to conquer. They had enough stored grain and water to last for years. They had a large, well-equipped army. Their king, a man named Nabonidus, though he was largely absent, spending most of his time in Arabia on religious expeditions, had left Babylon in the charge of his son Belshazzar. And the defenses were real. They were formidable. But there were cracks that a careful, patient, strategic general could find and exploit. Cyrus began his campaign against Babylon's territories in 540 BCE, methodically working through outlying cities and regions. He defeated a Babylonian army at a major battle near the city of Opis on the Tigris River. This battle was fierce, and there was significant loss of life. Cyrus was not always able to win without real fighting. But then Cyrus did something that would become one of the most famous military maneuvers in ancient history. He solved the Euphrates River problem. The river was the city's greatest protection and its greatest weakness, if you knew how to think about it. Cyrus divided his army and stationed troops on both the northern and southern sections of the Euphrates, where it entered and exited the city. Then he ordered the construction of canals and channels that would divert the Euphrates. His engineers dug furiously, rerouting the water into a large lake or marsh to the north of the city. Slowly, the water level in the Euphrates where it passed through Babylon began to drop. Then, one night, some historians believe it was October 12, 539 BCE, the water had dropped low enough that soldiers could wade through the river channel under the walls. Persian soldiers splashed through the dark, chest-deep water, moving silently under the massive walls of Babylon. They reached the iron gates. They found them, through either incredible luck or careful intelligence work, left open. Perhaps the guards were distracted. There's a dramatic story in the Bible's book of Daniel about that very night, about Belshazzar feasting in his palace, while mysterious writing appeared on the wall, and how Babylon fell that same evening, while the king partied inside. However it happened, the gates were unguarded or open or undermanned. The Persian soldiers moved through, then more soldiers, then more. Babylon fell in a single night. The city that was supposed to be impossible to conquer, the city whose walls were the wonder of the world, was taken without its great walls ever being breached. And then Cyrus did what Cyrus always did. He didn't sack the city, he didn't massacre the population, he didn't burn the temples. He rode into Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His propagandists, his official writers and priests, crafted a message that was simultaneously politically brilliant and by ancient standards genuinely humane. They said that the Babylonian god Marduk himself had chosen Cyrus to come and save the Babylonian people from their neglectful king Nabonidus. Whether or not Cyrus actually believed any of this doesn't change the fact that the effect was remarkable. The Babylonian priests, who had been deeply unhappy with Nabonidus' neglect of their traditional religious duties, welcomed Cyrus almost enthusiastically. The common people, who had suffered under heavy taxation and the general chaos of Nabonidus' absent rule, saw Cyrus' arrival as at worst a change of management. and at best, a rescue. Cyrus personally made a point of worshipping at the temple of Marduk. He respected the local religion. He maintained the city's structures and traditions. He appointed administrators to run Babylon who would continue its functions smoothly. He walked in as a conqueror. He acted as a protector. And then he did the thing that would make his name echo down through history for millennia. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus claims that the Babylonians were so busy celebrating a festival when Cyrus's soldiers came through the river gates that the outer parts of the city had already been taken before the people in the center even knew something was happening. It shows that even the best defenses in the world are useless if the people behind them aren't paying attention. He set the captives free. Chapter 8, the world's first human rights declaration, the Cyrus Cylinder. We have arrived at perhaps the most important moment in our story. Not a battle, not a conquest. A piece of clay. In 1879, archaeologists digging in the ruins of ancient Babylon, in what is now the country of Iraq, found something extraordinary. It was a small barrel-shaped cylinder, about 23 centimeters long, made of baked clay. It was covered from top to bottom in tiny, precise cuneiform writing, the ancient wedge-shaped script of Mesopotamia. When scholars translated it, they realized they were looking at something that had been baked into clay over 2,500 years ago, yet spoke to the deepest values of the modern world. It was the Cyrus Cylinder, and it recorded what Cyrus had done when he took control of Babylon. Let me summarize what it says in terms you can really feel. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he declared that he had not come to oppress, but to restore. He had not come to enslave, but to free. He commanded that all peoples who had been brought to Babylon against their will, people taken from their homes in foreign lands, forced to live in exile, separated from their gods and their traditions, were free to return to their homelands. He ordered that their temples, which had been neglected or destroyed, should be rebuilt. He ordered that religious practices that had been suppressed should be restored. He freed political prisoners and slaves. He reduced excessive taxation. He declared essentially that people had the right to live in their own land, worship their own gods, speak their own language, and live according to their own traditions, even while living under his empire. This was the ancient world. This was 539 BCE. This was a time when the standard practice for conquering kings was to enslave defeated peoples, tear down their temples, force them to worship the conqueror's gods, erase their culture and identity. Cyrus said, people are not cattle to be moved around at a conqueror's whim. People have homes, people have gods, people have identities, and I will respect that. The United Nations, the international organization founded after World War II to promote peace, justice, and human rights around the world, recognized the Cyrus Cylinder as one of the earliest known declarations of human rights in recorded history. A replica of the cylinder sits in the United Nations headquarters in New York City to this day. Now let's be careful and honest here, because good history requires honesty. Some modern historians debate whether the Cyrus Cylinder truly constitutes a human rights declaration in the modern sense. They point out that it was also a piece of political propaganda. Cyrus was partly trying to win the favor of the Babylonian people by presenting himself as a good ruler sent by their own god. The cylinder doesn't mention any universal principle of human freedom. It's focused on specific actions related to specific peoples in Babylon. And it's also true that the Persian Empire was not a perfect society. It had slaves, it used forced labor for building projects. The empire was ultimately still a place where Cyrus and his successors held enormous, sometimes brutal power. But here's what remains genuinely remarkable and what historians across the world agree on. In a world where the standard was cruelty, Cyrus chose a different path. In an era when defeated peoples were routinely massacred or enslaved, Cyrus built a policy of religious tolerance and cultural respect. In a time when emperors were usually worshipped as gods who could do anything they wanted, Cyrus understood that good governance meant caring about the people you governed. He wasn't a perfect saint. He was a real person, a complex person, a political person. But by the standards of his time, and honestly, by the standards of many times since, his approach to ruling was extraordinary. The Cyrus Cylinder was written in Babylonian cuneiform. the ancient writing system of Mesopotamia, not in Persian. This was deliberate. Cyrus was speaking to the Babylonian people in their own language, both literally and figuratively. It showed a sophistication and cultural awareness that was genuinely remarkable for an ancient conqueror. Now, one of the most moving consequences of Cyrus's decree of freedom for captive peoples involves a community that had been waiting, weeping, and praying for this moment for almost 50 years. The Jewish people. Chapter 9, Let My People Go, Cyrus and the Jewish Exile. In 586 BCE, about 50 years before Cyrus conquered Babylon, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II had done something devastating. He had marched on Jerusalem, the holy city at the heart of the Jewish homeland of Judah. He had besieged it, starved it, broken through its walls. His soldiers had burned the temple, the great temple of Solomon, the most sacred place in the Jewish world, the house of God, to the ground. And then he had taken the people. The nobles, the priests, the craftsmen, the leaders, tens of thousands of Jewish people had been marched hundreds of miles across the desert to Babylon as captives. This was the Babylonian exile. The Jewish people were not physically enslaved in the sense of being kept in chains. Many were settled in communities near Babylon and could have relatively normal lives. But they were far from home, forbidden from returning, living in a foreign land, their temple destroyed, their homeland occupied. They wept, they prayed, they wrote poems of heartbreak that we can still read today in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Psalms. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Zion was the name for Jerusalem, for their home. They waited 50 years of longing, 50 years of prayer. And then Cyrus came. The Cyrus cylinder specifically references the return of peoples to their homelands, and the Hebrew Bible, particularly the books of Ezra and Isaiah, records what Cyrus did for the Jewish people with unmistakable clarity. The book of Ezra begins with these words: In the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus king of Persia to make a proclamation throughout his realm. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. Cyrus issued an official decree. Any Jewish person who wanted to return to their homeland of Judah, to Jerusalem, was free to go. He also ordered that gold and silver from the royal treasury be contributed to help them rebuild the temple. He even returned the sacred objects that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple, golden bowls, silver bowls, other sacred vessels, and sent them back to Jerusalem with the returning people. Around 538 BCE, a great group of Jewish exiles, the book of Ezra says approximately 42,360 people plus servants, began the long march home. They returned to a ruined city. Jerusalem was broken, its walls demolished, its temple a pile of ash and rubble. But they were home, free, with permission and even financial support from the Persian king to rebuild what had been destroyed. The temple in Jerusalem was eventually rebuilt. It's called the Second Temple in Jewish history, and it would stand for another 500 years until the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE. In the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Isaiah, there is a prophecy, written decades before Cyrus was even born, that mentions him by name. Isaiah 44:28 says, Who says of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, Let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. In the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is called the Anointed One of God. In Hebrew, the word is Mashiach, which gives us the English word Messiah. This is the only place in the entire Hebrew Bible where a non-Jewish, non-Israelite person is given that title. It tells you something profound about how the Jewish people felt about this Persian king who had shown them such extraordinary kindness. Cyrus was not Jewish. He didn't worship the God of Israel. He was a Persian king with his own religious traditions. Historians debate exactly what his personal beliefs were. He may have been a follower of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion founded by the prophet Zoroaster, which taught that the world was a struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and lies. But whatever his personal faith, his actions spoke clearly. He gave a broken, exiled people their home back. That is a fact that has echoed through Jewish history, through Christian history, through world history, for 2,500 years. Fun fact: the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon is one of the most historically documented events in the ancient world. It appears in Persian records, in the Hebrew Bible, and is confirmed by archaeology. It is one of those wonderful moments in history where multiple completely different sources from completely different cultures all tell the same story from different angles. Cyrus had built an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. It stretched from the borders of India and Central Asia in the east, through Persia, Media, Babylonia, Syria, and Judah, all the way to the Aegean Sea in the west. But Cyrus was not finished. There were still lands to explore, still campaigns to fight, still frontiers to push. And the eastern frontier, the wild, dangerous lands of Central Asia, was calling. Chapter 10: The Edge of the World, Cyrus and the Eastern Campaigns. While Cyrus's most famous conquests were in the west, Media, Lydia, and Babylon, his empire also had to be built and defended in the east. The eastern borders of the Persian Empire were vast, difficult, and dangerous. They included enormous stretches of the Central Asian steppes, those enormous, wind-swept grasslands stretching through what are today the countries of Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. They included mountain ranges of breathtaking size and ferocity. They were home to fierce nomadic peoples who were expert horsemen and archers. At some point after his great western conquests, historians estimate the 540s and 530s BCE, Cyrus turned his attention eastward. He conducted campaigns in the region of Bactria, roughly modern Afghanistan, and Sogdia, roughly modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. These campaigns are not as well documented as his western conquests, but ancient sources confirm they happened, and archaeological evidence backs this up. He founded, or expanded, a number of cities in the east. One of the most significant was a city called Cyropolis, which literally means City of Cyrus, located in Sogdia. This city sat at a strategically important location along trade routes that would later become part of the ancient Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Cyrus also apparently undertook campaigns into what we today call Pakistan and northwestern India. Ancient sources suggest his empire's eastern border reached approximately to the Indus River, though the exact extent of Persian control in this region during Cyrus's reign is debated by historians. What the eastern campaigns tell us is important. Cyrus wasn't just a conqueror of well-known established civilizations, he was also a pioneer, pushing into the wild, unmapped edges of the known world, encountering peoples and landscapes that most Persians had never seen. Now, let's talk about something important. How was this enormous empire actually run? Cyrus was a brilliant conqueror, but conquering territory is only half the challenge. The real art of empire building is keeping what you've conquered together, functioning and stable. Cyrus's approach to governing his empire was, like his approach to conquering it, genuinely innovative. He divided the empire into large administrative regions called satrapies, each one governed by an official called a satrap, which roughly translates as protector of the kingdom. Satraps were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and managing their region on the king's behalf. But here's the key thing. Cyrus often appointed local people from the conquered territories themselves, to serve as satraps. Not just Persians, not just Medes, people who knew the local customs, language, and geography, who had the trust of the local population. This was again remarkably different from how other ancient empires worked. Most conquerors installed their own people everywhere, treating conquered territories as plunder to be extracted by loyal loyalists. Cyrus understood that local people governing local places was more efficient and caused less resentment. He also maintained the local languages and writing systems in each part of the empire, rather than forcing everyone to use Persian. Administrative documents have been found in Elamite, Babylonian, Aramaic, and other languages, all used in the Persian bureaucracy simultaneously. It was in many ways the ancient world's first experiment in multicultural governance. The Persian royal road system, which Cyrus began developing and his successors expanded, eventually stretched nearly 2,700 kilometers from Sardis in western Turkey to Susa in southwestern Iran. There were royal posting stations along the way where government messengers could get fresh horses, allowing messages to travel the entire length in just 7 days. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus marveled at this system, and it inspired the famous saying about the American Pony Express, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat," a quote actually taken from Herodotus's description of Persian royal couriers. Now we come to the last chapter of Cyrus's life, and it is a chapter that is in many ways a mystery, because the ancient sources don't all agree on exactly what happened. What we know for certain is this: Cyrus the Great died sometime around 530 BCE. He died fighting. Chapter 11, The Final Battle, the Death of a Legend. Every great story has an ending, and the ending of Cyrus's story is both tragic and fitting. Tragic because it came before his time. Fitting because he died the way he lived, out on the frontier, fighting for his empire, refusing to stay safely behind while others did the hard work. By around 530 BCE, Cyrus was likely in his 60s, perhaps even older. He had been king of Anshan since approximately 559 BCE, and the Achaemenid Great King since his conquest of Media around 550 BCE. He had spent the better part of 30 years in almost constant military activity. The threat he faced in his final campaign came from the north and northeast, from the vast steppes of Central Asia. Living on those steppes were various groups of nomadic peoples whom the ancient Greeks called Scythians. The Persians themselves used different names for different groups. One group that features prominently in the ancient accounts of Cyrus's death were called the Massagetae, a fierce, horse-riding, formidable people who lived in the regions east of the Caspian Sea, in roughly what is today Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. The most detailed account of Cyrus's final campaign comes from Herodotus, though historians caution that some elements of his account may be legendary or exaggerated. According to Herodotus, the Massagetae were led by a queen, a powerful, courageous woman named Tomyris. Tomyris was ruling as queen because her husband, the previous king, had died. She ruled in her own right, with full authority over her warrior people. Cyrus sent envoys to Tomyris with what appeared to be a marriage proposal. He wanted to marry her, which would have been a way of absorbing the Massagetae into his empire without a war. Tomyris saw through it immediately. She understood that this was not really about marriage, it was about conquest. She refused. Cyrus then prepared to cross the Araxes River, a major river that served as a border between Persian territory and Massagetae land. Herodotus says he received advice from two very different counselors. One was a man named Croesus. Yes, the same Croesus, the former king of Lydia, whom Cyrus had spared years before, who was now apparently serving as an advisor in the Persian court. Croesus told Cyrus, "Do not fight in the enemy's territory if you can avoid it. Let Tomyris come to you." The other option was to cross and engage. Cyrus crossed. He crossed the Araxes River and advanced into Massagetae territory. The first engagement went extremely well for the Persians. They defeated a portion of the Massagetae force, including, according to Herodotus, capturing Tomyris's own son, Spargapises, who commanded the Massagetae troops. But then things turned dark. Spargapises, the queen's son, shamed by his capture, managed to get himself freed from his bonds, perhaps by pleading that he should not die in chains, and then immediately killed himself. He chose death over the dishonor of captivity. Tomyris was devastated, and then she was furious. She sent a message to Cyrus: "You bloodthirsty Cyrus, do not be puffed up by this achievement. Restore my son to me, and leave my country with your forces intact. If you will not, I swear by the sun, the sovereign lord of the Massagetae, that for all your insatiability, I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus did not retreat. The two armies met in what Herodotus called the greatest battle between barbarian nations that I know of, a brutal, ferocious clash on the Central Asian steppe. The Massagetae won. The Persian army was badly defeated, and somewhere in that battle, on those windswept plains east of the Caspian Sea, Cyrus the Great died. He was approximately 70 years old. The exact circumstances of his death are disputed. Different ancient sources tell different stories. Herodotus says Tomyris found his body, cut off his head, and submerged it in a bag of human blood, saying, "I promised you your fill of blood, and so I give it to you." Whether that actually happened, or is a legend added to explain the death of a famous conqueror, historians cannot say for certain. What is not in dispute is that Cyrus died in battle against the Massagetae, around 530 BCE. Other ancient sources, including Ctesias, another Greek historian, give different accounts of his death, placing it in a different location with different details. Xenophon, in his biography of Cyrus, actually describes him dying peacefully in his bed, surrounded by his children. This disagreement between sources is frustrating for historians, but also fascinating. It tells us that even in ancient times, Cyrus's death was surrounded by legend, by competing stories, by the kind of mythologizing that great figures attract. What we know for certain is that his body was brought back to Persia, and he was buried in a tomb that still stands today in the ancient Persian city of Pasargadae in the province of Fars in modern Iran. The tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae is one of the most visited ancient monuments in Iran. It is a simple, elegant stone structure, a rectangular chamber sitting on a stepped stone platform about 11 meters high. Compared to the enormous pyramids of Egypt or the elaborate burial mounds of other ancient kings, it is almost modest. According to ancient accounts, the tomb bore an inscription that read, "O man, I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire and was king of Asia. Grudge me not therefore this monument." When Alexander the Great visited the tomb about 200 years after Cyrus's death, he ordered it restored and repaired out of deep respect. Cyrus was gone, but what he had built would last. Chapter 12. The Empire he left behind, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. When Cyrus died, he left behind something extraordinary. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire he had founded, was at the time of his death the largest empire the world had ever seen. It covered approximately 5.5 million square kilometers. To give you a sense of scale, that's about half the size of the continental United States. Or another way to think about it, it covered more land than all of Europe. It stretched from the Indus River in the east, the great river that runs through modern Pakistan, all the way to the Aegean Sea in the west, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It contained dozens of different peoples, languages, religions, and cultures. And it functioned. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing. An empire that large, that diverse, that multilingual, in an era before phones, before internet, before railroads, before any of the modern tools we use to hold large systems together. It functioned. People paid taxes, trade flowed, cities were maintained, disputes were resolved, religious practices were protected. It functioned because of the remarkable system of governance that Cyrus had established. The satrap system, the division of the empire into provinces ruled by trusted governors, allowed local administration to function without constant interference from the central power. The road system allowed information and people to move with unprecedented speed. The policy of cultural and religious tolerance kept local populations from constantly rebelling. Cyrus's successors continued his work. His son Cambyses II added Egypt to the empire. The Persian Empire now included the ancient Nile civilization. Then Darius the Great, one of Cyrus's successors, expanded the empire even further and built much of the stunning infrastructure we associate with ancient Persia, including the magnificent ceremonial capital at Persepolis, with its giant carved pillars and sweeping staircases, which you can still visit in ruins today in modern Iran. At its peak, under Darius and his son Xerxes, the Achaemenid Persian Empire contained an estimated 44% of the entire world's population. Nearly half of every human being alive on Earth lived within its borders. No empire before or since has come close to that proportion of world population. It was the mightiest human civilization our planet has ever produced, measured by the share of humanity it encompassed. And it all began with one man who started with a collection of mountain tribes and a vision. Fun fact, the Persian capital of Persepolis, built by Cyrus's successors, was one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world. Its ruins, still standing in modern Iran, show enormous carved stone reliefs depicting representatives from dozens of different nations of the empire, each bringing gifts to the Persian king. Remarkably, they are shown in their own unique national costumes, carrying their own traditional items, a deliberate artistic statement that the empire was a collection of proud peoples, not a mass of faceless subjects. Even in stone art, the Achaemenid Persians communicated their philosophy of tolerance and respect. But empires, no matter how great, do not last forever. The Achaemenid Persian Empire came to an end in 330 BCE, about 200 years after Cyrus's death. when it was conquered by one of the most famous military geniuses in history, Alexander the Great of Macedon. And here is one of history's most beautiful ironies. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he was deeply fascinated by Cyrus. He studied Cyrus. He admired Cyrus. He visited Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae and was moved by what he saw. When he found that tomb robbers had vandalized the tomb and desecrated Cyrus's burial, Alexander was furious. He had the violators punished and the tomb restored. The man who ended the empire Cyrus built admired Cyrus so deeply that he treated the founder's grave with reverence. Even in defeat, even across 2 centuries of time, Cyrus commanded respect.